Welcome to the last unit of Philosophy 203 online. This unit will be concerning applied ethics. Right? This is the part of ethics that people usually get really excited about. That's the thing they want to start doing right away. Say, oh, great, we're going to talk about ethics, and so they immediately want all these, fun cases and burning issues of our day and hot topics and things like that. But of course, that's a little bit like walking onto a Habitat for Humanity build site and being like, "Hey, let's build a house." And of course, they don't. If you've ever done that, they don't say yes, let's. They say, "Hold on, slow down, wait a minute. This is a hammer." Okay, and you say, "Great, let's go build a house." And they're like, No, this is a hammer, right? You have to have some appreciation of what kinds of tools you use, what they're used for, before any larger project makes any sense. And ethics is no different. Before you can apply ethical theories or a basic toolbox of ethical reasoning to some applied topic, you have to have said toolbox of ethical reasoning. So that's what we've been working up to so far. And so the first thing we want to talk about is most topics in applied ethics involve some kind of reasonable disagreement about morality. And there are several levels at which people can disagree about morality. And I think it's very, very important to be able to recognize at what level one is disagreeing. And so the several levels of these, it starts with the most fundamental level. Okay, this is where the disagreement is about what fundamental value is really most important here. And it's less common, I think, for people to run into this one. I've listed it first because it's the most large scale kind of disagreement, the most fundamental disagreement somebody can have. And the way it would go is something like this. I mean, say, for example, one person thought that morality was the most important thing in a particular situation, or another person thought it was some other thing entirely that was the most important thing. In this case, you're not arguing about what's moral and what's not. You're arguing about whether morality is really what's important here or not, right? And that's like I said, those are arguments you don't see very often. Those are disagreements that are, again, highly fundamental, highly abstract, and even in the philosophical literature, you're not going to see a whole lot of that until you get to, say, for example, graduate school. So, not going to say very much about those. The more common levels of disagreement about morality that we see in, a given period of time is a disagreement about moral theory. So the idea is that two people might agree that what's important here is the right thing to do, the moral good. It's just that they disagree about what the moral good actually is. That is, they disagree about how to determine what the right thing is, even though they both think that it's important that the right thing be done. Okay, so they agree about number one, but number two is that they disagree about what makes something right, and that's what a moral theory is. It's a thing that tells you how to decide what the right thing to do is. And so this can take a number of forms. It can take the form of people who have competing theories of morality, say, for example, utilitarianism and Kantianism or something else. These are very different theories of morality. Or else, two different people might have different versions, right, of the same theory. And we'll talk about some examples of each of those things as we go. And the last kind of disagreement about morality that someone could have, they could agree that morality is what's most important. They could also agree that on the moral theory. They might, for example, both be utilitarians, and they might disagree about some other non-moral facts. And again, we'll talk about some examples of that here in a minute. Let's talk about number two here before we go on further. So I wanted to give you some examples of conflicts between moral theories that you actually find in real philosophical literature talking about topics in applied ethics. And so one of these is one that we've already sort of seen. We used a different argument or a different article from Singer, but it contained essentially the same argument as the one he gives in Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And it's an argument about assisting the poor. And it goes again like this. To refresh your memory. The premise one is that suffering is bad. Okay, if you are talking to somebody who doesn't agree with this premise, well, it seems like the discussion can really go no further. Premise two is that if you can prevent something bad without sacrificing something of comparable moral value, then you're morally obligated to do so. All right, seems quite reasonable. Premise three, you can, in fact, prevent suffering without sacrificing something of comparable moral value by sacrificing luxuries and giving away the money instead. And so the justification for this premise should sound pretty familiar. The idea is that How much happier does a $100 pair of designer jeans make you compared to that much food and medical care somebody who doesn't have any, right? It seems like it has that $100 has a much bigger impact if it's used to prevent dire suffering than if it's used on some luxury item, which is why we call them luxury items. And so it seems like one really can, right, prevent suffering without sacrificing something of comparable moral value. And so then the conclusion is that you are morally obligated to do that. That's part of what morality tells you to do. And again, this is a very demanding argument, but it's a utilitarian argument, right? And there are a lot of dead giveaways that this is a utilitarian argument. So at the very least, we have stuff about like, say for example, preventing something bad, right? I mean, this is pretty good. This is a dead giveaway that what's going on here is consequentialist in some sense, right? The idea is that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have some effect on the world, right? That's what makes your action the right one or the wrong one, is what the results of your action are, whether you're preventing something bad or creating something good, etc. And so at the very least, you can see that that's absolutely a consequentialist view, right? Add in this, okay? What is actually what makes something good or bad? Well, we start talking about suffering, right? And Peter Singer talks very much about pains, right? The sort of pains that are brought about by lack of food and medical care, and weighing that against the pleasures one gets from luxury items, etc. Okay, so if you have consequentialism and you add on hedonism, okay, and you get this notion of like trying to put all those things together, weigh them, and pick the best one, well, now you've got all three elements of utilitarianism, right? You've got hedonism, you've got consequentialism, and you've got this sum totaling and maximization of well-being. So pretty obviously, Singer is giving us a utilitarian argument. That's important to recognize, right? One very famous response to Singer's article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, is an argument from a fellow by the name of John Arthur. And he gives something like the following argument. And since we haven't read it before, I've quoted several paragraphs out of it. The article in full is called Famine Relief and the Ideal Moral Code. Really excellent article. And if you want to get a hold of a copy, just talk to any MCC librarian. They can get you a copy of it. And so here's one paragraph of it. It says, equality, okay, in the sense of giving equal consideration to equally serious needs, is part of our moral code. And so we are led, quite rightly, I think, to the conclusion that we should prevent harm to others if in doing so we do not sacrifice anything of comparable moral importance. Now, this is interesting. What we often expect when we think that two people are in a dispute is that they disagree about everything. And that's a little bit simple-minded, okay? In fact, most of the easy stuff, most people agree about most things most of the time, right? These are all the easy things. It's usually little things or nuances that people tend to disagree about, and this is no exception. And so he says, here's where the disagreement is. He's like, I agree that if we really can prevent some great harm without really costing us anything, we should do it. He says, there's another side of the coin, though, one that Singer ignores. This can be expressed rather awkwardly by the notion of entitlements. While your life may be shortened by the loss of a kidney or less enjoyable if lived with only one eye, these costs are probably not comparable to the loss experienced by a person who will die without any kidney or who is totally blind. So again, think of it, put this through Singer's argument. If you have two eyes and somebody else has no eyes, you will lose less by losing one eye than they will gain by gaining one eye. And so it seems like you're sort of obligated to do that. Or I think if you have two good kidneys and another person has no good kidneys, right? Well, they will gain more from getting one kidney than you will lose by losing one kidney. So again, it seems like Singer's argument would demand that as well. And I think it's possible that it really may. I told you utilitarianism is demanding. Now, of course, the utilitarian might say, "Well, look, what do you want from me? I'm telling you, whatever. If something really has the best consequences, then it's the best action." They can still stand on that, and it does make a kind of sense. So Arthur continues. He says, if anything is clear, however, it is that our code does not require such heroism. You are entitled to keep your second eye and kidney, and the reason for this is often expressed in terms of rights. Okay, so if he's going to be talking about rights, you all of a sudden know he's not using a utilitarian framework, because utilitarians generally don't can't talk about universal rights, right? It's not necessarily a thing that comes out of utilitarianism very well. So it's your body, you have a right to it, and that weighs against, okay, let's talk about that here, that weighs against whatever duty you have to help, okay? So who is it that starts talking about weighing some duties against others, right? If you know, just go ahead and shout it out, right? I can't like hear you, but I'm trusting that you'll do this. Uh, so think about that for a second. So what he's saying is that we have certain rights, that is, rights to our bodies, that do weigh against, right, this other good moral principle, this principle of equality. So equality weighs against rights in this case. Well, let's continue on in his argument. He says desert is a second form of entitlement. So rights are one form of entitlement. Desert is the second form of entitlement for John Arthur. He says, suppose, for example, an industrious farmer manages through hard work to produce a surplus of food for the winter, while a lazy neighbor spends his summer fishing. Must our industrious farmer ignore his hard work and give the surplus away because his neighbor or family will suffer? Sure, it'd be nice of him if he did. What again seems clear is that we have more than one factor to weigh, right? Not only should we compare the consequences of keeping it with his giving it away, we should also weigh the fact that one farmer deserves the food. He earned it through his hard work. Perhaps his deserving the product of his labor is outweighed by the greater need of his lazy neighbor, or perhaps it isn't. But being outweighed is in any case not the same thing as weighing nothing. Okay? So again, who is it that seems to say, look, you've got all kinds of duties, and they all really are your duties, even when one of them overrides another? Okay? If you don't have it yet, you should really have it by now, but we'll continue. He says, our commonly shared morality thus requires that we ignore neither consequences nor entitlements, neither the future results of our action nor relevant events in the past. It encourages people to help others in need, especially when it's a friend or someone we are close to geographically and when the cost is not significant. But it also gives weight to rights and desert so that we are not usually obligated to give to strangers. And the paragraph goes on to qualify that a bit. But if that doesn't sound like Ross, I don't know what does. Okay, and so what we have in this particular case, this disagreement between John Arthur and Peter Singer about the appropriate response to world poverty, is we have one, Peter Singer, who takes a very standard utilitarian approach, and Arthur, who takes a moral pluralist, non-consequentialist approach. Right? He thinks that consequences matter, but they're not all that matters. He thinks there among other things are rights and desert that matters. There's the entitlement that he calls them. And so he thinks that in some cases, right, the consequences really will outweigh rights or desert, and in other cases, rights or desert will outweigh the consequences, and that one has to be very careful in each case. It's a very standard, sort of Rossian line, and so this is an example of where two different moral theories are used to disagree with one another. I also wanted to give you an example of where people can have competing versions of essentially the same moral theory. And again, I'm going to go back to Peter Singer, and this should probably tell you, if you don't know enough about Peter Singer by now, he's a utilitarian. He's very straightforwardly a utilitarian. He's one of our most famous utilitarians. He's very famous in applying utilitarianism to contemporary issues. And so he also has an argument for the rights of animals, and this is excerpted from a piece called Practical Ethics. Okay? And it's written this way. So he says, if a being suffers, this is Singer's words, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted equally with the like suffering, insofar as rough comparisons can be made of any other being. Okay, so that sentence, right? That idea, that first little bit of things, this sort of principle of equality, as he puts it. This this should tell you something that you again already know about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is very highly impartial. It applies to everybody. Everybody's pains count, everybody's pleasure counts, and they count equally, right? And so this is the basis on which Singer is going to apply utilitarian moral theory to the plight of non-human animals. It says if a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there's nothing to be taken into account. So rocks, for example. This is why the limit of sentience, using this term as a convenient if not strictly accurate shorthand for the capacity to suffer or experience enjoyment or happiness, is the only defensible boundary or concern for the interests of others. So this is actually somewhat interesting. The term sentience here um, is often misused, especially in science fiction. People talk about something being sentient to refer to it being as a thinking thing, right? Something is sentient if it can think and reason and do all sorts of things. Actually, the term sentience comes from the root word sense, right? As in our senses, the five senses. So if it can feel, it is sentient, right? That's all. That's all the word means. What science fiction writers should have been saying all these many years is sapient, right? That's what it means to think or reason. It comes from a word sapiens, meaning wisdom. Okay, so still aside there. And so he says to mark this boundary, right, the boundary between things that are morally worthy of consideration and things that are not morally worthy of consideration, by some other characteristic like intelligence or rationality, would be to mark it in an arbitrary way. Why not choose some other characteristic like skin color? It's a rhetorical question, of course. And so his belief here is that intelligence, right, or rationality, is in some sense an arbitrary marker, right? And the reason he's going to say that is because of what it comes later in the article, what he calls marginal cases. So he says, look, just the fact that infants aren't rational, nor are they intelligent, but we still treat them as if they matter. And he thinks that the reason for that is they feel pain, right? So if your cat or your dog or a cow or a sheep feels pain, well, then you need to consider that pain as well. Again, it's a very straightforwardly utilitarian argument involving just straight up quantities of pleasures and pains. And opposing that, we could have, say, an article by Ruth Sigmund that's called Death, Misfortune, and Species Inequality. And again, if you want any copies of these things, just talk to any MCC librarian, they can get you one. And Sigmund writes, if one thinks with Bentham that all the good and bad things that can happen to one in life are quantities of pleasurable and painful experience, then the comparison between animal and human misfortune will appear quite reasonable, for it is plausible, given this conception, to suggest that one can distinguish degrees of intensity of animal pain as well as one can do this with human pain. But notice that this view suggests A, that all misfortune involves unpleasant experiences, and B, that all unpleasant experiences are measurable against one another, which is most implausible where tragedies and many other severe misfortunes are concerned. So she's going to highlight here that what's going on are, in a sense, quantities of pleasure and pain, right? Or degrees of intensity, right? That's just another word for quantity, right? So this is the piece of utilitarianism that Sigmund is going to take exception with. Now, Sigmund's going to offer a kind of utilitarian or consequentialist argument here, but she's going to offer one that does not rely on pure quantities of pleasure. And so, in effect, she'll be making the same move as John Stuart Mill did when he responded to the philosophy of swine objection, right? Bringing in qualities. So she puts it this way: to be a possible subject of misfortunes, which are not merely unpleasant experiences, one must be able to desire and value certain things. The kind of misfortune, okay, we're talking about types of misfortune, not quantities now, which is in question here is death. And to discover whether this is a misfortune for an animal, we must ask whether or in what sense animals don't want to die. Of course, in some sense, this is true of virtually all animals, which manifest acute fear when their lives are threatened. Yet blindly clinging on to life is not the same thing as wanting to live because one values life. This is the kind of desire for life of which persons are capable. It is this which gives sense to the claim that death is a misfortune, even a tragedy, for a person. I think there are some other examples one could give that are even clearer. One example I often use when discussing this particular article is this. And so, uh, just a little background information. I have a couple of pets. I have a cat and a dog. The cat I've had for about 13 years now, since he was a kitten. He looks like he's wearing a tuxedo. Right? That just shows his markings. It's adorable. Um, and sometimes I will, in good nature, tease him about being all dressed up with nowhere to go, and sort of see him in the morning, I'm like, oh, a tuxedo at 6 in the morning. What's going on? What do what kind of a household do you think this is? Just stuff like that, right? That if I were to direct those kinds of comments at a person, it would be called mockery. I would be mocking them, right? Well, it might be wrong to mock a person because a person is the kind of thing that can actually appreciate mockery, right? They can feel bad about being mocked. I have absolutely no evidence. Again, maybe I'm radically wrong about this. I have no evidence that my cat knows that I'm mocking him, right? And so it's something that's done more or less for my own amusement. I get amusement out of it. He doesn't have any idea. He just hears noises, and that's all. He just wants his food, and he wants a nice warm place to lay down, and he wants to have some petting every now and then. That's his life. So again, it's one of those things where if the animal can't conceptualize their own existence, and they're not existing after they die, or even not existing before they were born, and all that sort of stuff, then it doesn't seem like death is a tragedy, right? It's not the sort of thing that counts as misfortune for them. It's like mockery doesn't seem like it can count as misfortune for a cat. So those are the sorts of examples Sigmund means. She means to talk about qualities of pleasure that are differential between humans and animals. So both of them can make a kind of utilitarian argument here, and uh, it's just that Sigmund's going to use a different version of utilitarianism to come to a somewhat different conclusion. Now, again, notice that just like John Arthur did not entirely disagree with Peter Singer. In fact, John Arthur thought we ought to be doing a great deal more than we are in fact doing about global poverty and those who are suffering in the world. Um, Likewise, Sigmund does not completely disagree with Singer. She thinks that all things being equal, we should be doing a whole lot more to be kinder to animals, that we should alleviate their suffering to a much greater degree than we do. We should treat them much better than we in fact do treat them. But she does say, right? She does think that an animal that has a good, happy life and then is killed humanely for food is not necessarily a bad thing. Right? This is the level of the disagreement. It's not a total disagreement, and that's something you're going to have to get used to with real, honest, moral views. Because in general, any decent moral view has at least some grain of truth to it. It's not the sort of thing with which one could completely disagree. And so the last kind of disagreement, this is number three, number slide ago, is a disagreement about non-moral facts. Okay, in this kind of a disagreement, the parties are agreed that morality is the issue, and they're also agreed on which moral theory is correct as how to determine morality. So, for example, they're both utilitarians of the same kind, right? Uh, but what they disagree about is what the consequences of X and Y in fact are. Notice that's a non-moral fact. What is the consequences of X? What are the consequences of Y? Those are the sorts of things that people can reasonably disagree about. They agree that they should choose whichever one has the best overall consequences, right? And that's the most important thing. But they might just disagree about what those consequences actually are. And they can do this in both the future and in the past, right? You can disagree about what the consequences of two possible actions would be. You can even look back and disagree about what the actual consequences of two things were, right? Would something have happened without the other thing, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, this is just because the world is in some sense uncertain, and that's a kind of disagreement that people can have within a moral issue. But it's important to notice in those cases that they agree about the main value. They agree about what the moral theory is and how it should be applied. What they disagree about is the facts of the matter, right? These sort of non-moral facts. And if this is where the level of disagreement is, well, then that points you to what sorts of things you should have to pay more close attention. All right. So beyond some very simple examples of what kinds of moral disagreements there are and can be in issues of applied ethics, we want to take the next step it's one thing to see an argument, right, that's sort of excerpted out of its total context and have relevant features of it pointed out. Okay, it's another thing to start to do this yourself, to read a whole article and then be able to pick out the relevant bits of it that tell you what's really going on. What kind of an argument is this person giving? What kind of a dispute are there between two different authors? And so what I want you to do is, as a really good example, as an exercise, I want you to read over the articles by Miller and Sussman, if you haven't by this point, about torture. And I want you to look for the following things. And again, don't go past this slide if you haven't done that. You won't get the benefit out of what's going on here if you just like continue through this all the way to the end. So the idea is by all means continue to the end of this slide, but don't go past this slide until until you really take a good close look at Miller and Sussman articles that are linked in the course readings. So both of them are they have a moral disagreement. They're talking about the morality of torture. Okay, been a big issue in ethics, especially about 10 years ago when there was all this controversy, especially during the Bush years, about whether torture should or shouldn't be used, or to what extent, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the atmosphere in which these articles are published. So one of the things to look at is, do they actually agree on the definition of torture to a great enough extent that they're actually talking about the same thing? This is very important, right? Because if the people aren't actually talking about the same thing, then they aren't actually disagreeing. Okay, and you have to be careful that people aren't just talking past each other. That's always one of the first things to make sure, is that people are not talking past each other. Right? So read over and think about that as you read it. What moral theory or theories does each make use of in order to make their case? Look, any moral argument is going to have some features about it that make it one version of a moral argument or other. It may not be exactly Kant, right? But it may have a lot in common with Kant, right? If it talks about, say, not treating people like things or treating people with a certain dignity, etc., that's Kant, right? I mean, whether or not the person even knows that that's Kant, that's Kant. If somebody's talking about consequences mattering, right? It's like, well, this action would cause X amount of pain, and this other action would cause so much less pain, and in fact, this action would cause the least amount of pain of all available actions. Even if they don't know that that's utilitarianism, that's utilitarianism. Okay, so you have to. There will be features of arguments that you're going to look at to make to see like what to do. So read through Miller and Sussman and just see what moral theory are they actually using in each case. And of course, we all know that each of these moral theories has certain problems. They have certain large-scale objections that people do make to those theories, and they also have some reasonable responses to those things. And so, for example, if somebody's using utilitarianism, you can bet that some particular objection to utilitarianism will be relevant to their take on that particular issue. And same for any other theory. So again, look through the article, see if you can find that. Think, what's their theory, and what sorts of problems are they just likely to run into because of their adoption of that particular theory. And finally, how do they differ on the relative moral wrongness of torture and killing? That is torture worse than killing, or is killing worse than torture? Right? Because it seems like they do disagree about this. And of course, think, why does this issue make an important difference? Right? Why have I told you to look for that? Okay. So again, this is the point at which you want to, if you have not yet read those articles, or if you've read them but haven't really thought about these things, stop now. Right? Do not move forward from this point until you do that, right? Otherwise, you won't get the benefit of this exercise, because we're going to go through some of the answers to those things. So what you want to do is you want to get those answers, you want to write them down, you want to think about them very clearly, you want to spend some time with the material, and then you want to say, okay, how did I do? Okay, and that's what we're going to do next. So I'm going to pause for a second, pause the video or stop the video. Okay, nice to see you again. So the question is, do Miller and Sussman agree on the definition of torture to a great enough extent that they are talking about the same thing? In fact, if you read both pieces, you'll find that they both stop fairly early in their pieces to define torture. And while their definitions of torture are not exactly the same, they're substantially similar. And some will include some accounts that the other does not, but in general, their basic idea of pain and suffering for to accomplish some purpose of the torturer is the idea, right? That's whether it be psychological or physical pain, that's neither here nor there. They've got a close enough idea that they really are talking about the same thing. So one of my pieces of advice about the final paper, which will concern the articles about abortion by Thompson and Marquis, is to keep track of all the different circumstances surrounding the different cases of abortion that they are mentioning, so that you're always comparing apples to apples. So that you're saying, if one of them says, well, abortion's okay in X circumstance, says abortion is not okay in Y circumstance. Well, you want them both talking about X circumstance, or you want them both talking about Y circumstance, or else you're again having accounts that talk past each other. So that's on you. You got to make sure to keep track of what the issues they are and are not referring to in each case. All right, so then let's move on to what theory or theories does each make use of in order to make their case. Okay. This one's actually fairly easy for this article. Um, so Miller comes just right out and says that his view is utilitarian, right? And if he didn't, it would be pretty clear, right? Because he's talking about the overall consequences and choosing cases where the consequences of the torture are going to be better than the consequences of not torturing it. I mean, all of the test cases he has, these sort of ticking time bomb scenarios, are quite obviously about the overall consequences, and that's a utilitarian approach. Um, well, Sussman actually comes right out and says that his view is, in his words, broadly Kantian. Right? Again, he talks about people's inherent dignity. He talks about people being used as things, being used as tools against themselves, and that's what's so terrible about torture. And again, this is stuff that might have come right out of the mouth of Kant, although probably clearer than Kant would have put it. And so again, it's just, even if he didn't say he was Kantian, we would be able to tell that he was Kantian um, by that kind of language and that kind of thought. Now, of course, it's not always that easy. Marquis and Thompson do not explicitly follow a moral theory. That is, they don't come right out and say, here's the moral theory I'm following. But again, their arguments have features that do put them in the category of one or more of the moral theories that we've been taking a look at. And so what you have to do is you have to say, okay, what is it that makes something utilitarian? What is it that makes it Kantian? What is it that makes it something pluralist, something like Ross, etc. And then you sort of look for that in each of those things there, and that involves actually knowing your moral theories, right? You have to have the right tools before you can do this well. Okay, so then it says describe one general problem with each of those moral theories. Describe how that problem affects their account of torture. Right? This is one of those things where again, use what you know. We already know that each of these moral theories that people might use have some problems that they're going to have to reckon with, and so if you already know that utilitarianism has certain kinds of issues, then you should expect at least some of those issues to be, of a concern when you're talking about torture. And quite obviously, the major problem with the utilitarian argument here is the problem of justice, right? Remember, the utilitarian will say that sometimes unjust things are required of people. So, and if torturing somebody isn't unjust, I don't know what is. And so that's the problem that utilitarians are going to have to run into, that they're going to have to defend doing something like torturing somebody. And of course, they have some reasonable responses to this objection, but it's going to be the major objection. Now, of course, if you want to stick to your guns and talk about people's rights and talk about what duties we owe to people, not treating people like things, etc., I mean, all that makes sense. That's a really good case. But quite obviously, the major problem with the Kantian perspective is the dire consequences objection. You say it's just like the guy that comes to Kant's door and says, "Hey, is your friend in there? I want to kill him," and Kant has to say yes, right? So you've got this situation where there's terrible consequences if you don't torture somebody, but you have to just sit there and say, "No, you can't torture people. It's just morally wrong." So that's going to be the obvious problem with the Kantian perspective, just like the utilitarian perspective has a horrible problem with injustice. So if these aren't the main focus of discussion, if they both authors don't address these problems, then they don't do much of a good job, and you wouldn't expect them to be assigned by your ethics professor. All right, so then if we move on, say, how do Miller and Sussman differ on the relative moral wrongness of torture and killing? Again, there's a passage where this is more or less literally contained. It's an interesting contrast in their view that you'd probably sort of blow right by if you weren't specifically asked to look for it, but it ends up revealing a lot about their thinking on the matter. Miller, turns out, it thinks that killing is worse than torture, and this probably informs why he thinks that he would advocate using torture to prevent deaths. Sussman thinks torture is actually worse than killing, and so that may motivate him for saying that it would in fact not. All right. So that having been done, right? That's good practice. If you didn't come out on that one as well as you thought you should have, or you ended up sort of writing down things that turned out not to be what the correct answers were there, then you've got to sort of start to go back a little further, right? Really make sure that you understand those moral theories. What makes one a moral theory, and you've still got all the material, you've got all the reading, got all the lectures, right? Hit something back, do a little review, because you want to make sure that you're going into this situation as well equipped as you can be. And so, when writing a paper about doing an analysis about a moral disagreement, here's some advice. Number one, read carefully. Okay, and by reading, we don't just mean passing our eyes over the material. You have to really think about it, and it's going to take longer than you think. And so, allow yourself plenty of time. And the second thing is use what you know, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about the basic moral theories, what's good about them, what's bad about them, and how they work, and how they answer the kinds of troubles that they have, and what kinds of troubles there are. We've talked a lot about that, and that's all stuff that is going to it cannot fail to be relevant to any possible article about morality. Okay, those are the basic toolkits of moral reasoning, and so you have to use them in order to do this properly. Okay? And so you have to use what we already know, use the toolbox. Just sort of floundering around and saying, well, I kind of think this or I kind of think that. That doesn't make any progress. That doesn't really do anything. They have to use what you already know here. Um, and some advice that's specific to this particular pair of articles, the article by Don Marquis and the one by Judith Jarvis Thompson. Um, so first off, don't assume that you know anything about moral arguments concerning abortion. This is like one of the big burning issues of our time. It's something a lot of people really care about. People talk about. People, maybe are members of organizations of one kind or another. But here's the thing: you've probably never actually heard a halfway decent moral argument about abortion. So don't assume that you have. Most of the arguments that you hear, most of the discussion you hear, is something that really it sounds good and it's really easy to repeat, but it's easier to just repeat something that sounded good to you than to think about it for 5 seconds, and so most people don't. But so, for example, if you talk about, say, when something is alive, right? It's like, well, it's about when life begins. Why, right? I mean, bacteria are all alive, but we don't like we don't care. We kill them in genocidal numbers on a regular basis, and I don't see any good argument for saying we shouldn't. So yeah, I mean, the fact that something is alive is just not morally relevant. Okay, it just isn't. And so it's a non-issue. So you'll say, okay, fine. What they mean is it's human, right? It's a human life, and that's what's important. It's the human part. Okay, well, corpses are human too. So if I cut off my arm, so it's a human arm, right? When I go to the bathroom, I leave behind human waste, right? So again, what is it about being human that's really important here? And in fact, Marquis takes some time out to discuss what's so bad about this argument. He says that the word human is ambiguous. Okay, it can be meant in just the biological sense, that is, like, has human DNA, right? Well, again, so does my left wrist. It has human DNA, but it by itself isn't morally considerable. So there's this biological definition of the word human that doesn't have any connection to morality at all. And then there's other time when we talk about human rights. Well, that's human used in the moral sense, right? And so if you want to say a fetus is a human, right, in that sense, you're just begging the question. You're arguing in a circle. You're already assuming that they have moral worth in order to say that they have moral worth, right? And so it's a bad argument. You have to think about it for about 5 seconds. Okay, well, and then sometimes people talk about, like, persons, right? It's like, oh, well, it's not a person yet, right? It doesn't have any of these, psychological features. It's like, well, neither do infants, right? Like right after they're born, they don't have any more mental capacity than or mental performance, certainly, than before they were born. So again, what's the difference? And again, nobody wants to start. So this notion of personhood is also pretty much irrelevant. So one of the things you'll notice right off is that Marquis just says, look, assume that a fetus is not a person, it's not human, it's nothing. Assume it's not even alive if you want. I don't care, right? It doesn't actually make any difference to his argument that abortion is, in general, morally wrong, seriously morally wrong. Thompson, meanwhile, is going to say, look, assume the fetus is an adult human being with as much as you like. Give it the full suite of whatever you think matters. Okay. And she's still going to argue that abortion is, in general, morally permissible. So again, the kinds of issues that people mostly focus on are really irrelevant, and they don't. Again, it's easy to repeat some of these things than to just to think about it for a few minutes, um, and talk in circles or whatever. So again, don't assume you know what these arguments are, because you don't. So you actually have to read them to find out. Okay, and then again, nuance, nuance, nuance. I've written it 3 times because it's important. So it's a feature of both of these cases that they don't treat all whole cases of abortion as exactly the same, and in fact most people don't. We have two things. We have like this pro-life and pro-choice thing that people talk about, but everybody in fact has more than two positions on abortion, and there's all kinds of exceptions and other different sort of circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. Like this is the normal way that people look at it, and so don't be fooled by the simplicity of our political discourse. It's a more complicated issue than just that, and in fact, it's treated that way by these two very thoughtful authors. So keep in mind there's all this nuance here, and that they're not going to disagree about everything. Okay, and so keep track of what they do and don't in fact disagree on, and why they do and don't disagree about those things. It's a real clue to what they're doing. And then finally, you're going to be asked to at some point evaluate their perspectives here. And this is the part where I think too many things take the wrong kind of left turn. The when I'm talking about evaluating a moral argument, we mean evaluating them on moral criteria. That is the kinds of things that are relevant to the quality of a moral theory, right? The kinds of problems and benefits that really exist in terms of moral theories. And too often what students will do is that they will talk about their own feelings, right? They'll say, well, I feel like this is the right thing, or this feels right to me, or this is what I was taught, or this is what I agree with, and so it's the better argument. Like, notice that's not actually what makes something a good or a bad argument, is whether you agree with it or not, or how you feel about it, right? It just isn't. Okay, your feelings are irrelevant to the fact of the matter, and so don't do that, right? It's that doesn't evaluate anything. That tells me how you feel about it, but that's not an evaluation. Also, sometimes what students will do, they'll say, "Oh, this author really had good examples." So what? Are they right or not? I mean, so or this author explained things very clearly. Those are matters of style. Okay, save that for literature class or speech class or something like that. I mean, those are areas where style is at least somewhat relevant. It matters how things are presented. In this case, it doesn't. Right. So, say one author has a better style or perhaps more clearly communicated their position than the other person. Well, that doesn't make them right. Okay, that just makes them have a clear article. That's all. That's not the kind of evaluation I'm talking about. That's not really the kind we care about. What we want are the kinds of objective matters that make moral theories better or worse. Right? Those are the kinds of things to focus on. And if you're thinking to yourself, my God, that's hard. Like, what even is that? Well, we've had an entire semester to talk about what even is that. And yes, it is hard. But nothing worthwhile is easy.